Hi, I'm Blake Lively, and I'm going to be taking the BuzzFeed quiz, which iconic Blake Lively character?
I've got all of your news for your Coravanta ride home, and tonight we are not easing into it. We are not stretching. We are not doing small talk. We are diving straight into the fire. Because new text messages have been unsealed in the Blake Lively versus Justin Baldoni saga, and if you thought after a year of covering this thing there was nothing left that could shock you, you were wrong. I was wrong. Everybody was wrong. These texts. They don't just show frustration. They don't just show tension. They show a narrative being built in real time. And it is wild. First story of the day, Blake Lively versus Justin Baldoni. New messages. Private conversations. Words that were clearly never meant to see daylight. And in those messages, Blake allegedly telling people in her inner circle that Baldoni was in a cult. Not just difficult. Not just egotistical. Not just creative differences. A cult. And not stopping there, attacking his religion, questioning his motives, mocking his spirituality, calling him a faux feminist, painting him as some self-appointed prophet figure. If you are trying to win sympathy in Hollywood, calling someone a cult leader is one way to do it. But once those receipts hit the sunlight? Different game, and let's pause right there. Because for months, the narrative that floated publicly was about on-set tension, power struggles, creative disagreements, maybe even inappropriate behavior depending on who you were listening to. But these texts, they suggest something else was happening behind the curtain. Something more coordinated. Something more personal. Now, we've talked about the Baha'i faith before on Coravanta. And every time it comes up, I brace myself for chaos. But here's the thing, the more I've actually looked into it, the more I've heard from people who practice it, the more it seems peaceful. Centered on unity. On the idea that religions are progressive chapters of the same spiritual story. On bringing people together instead of tearing them apart over which name they use for God. I'm not here recruiting for them. I'm not converting. I'm just saying, on paper, it's not some shadowy Hollywood mind control cult. It's not robe chanting in candlelit basements. It's a recognized global religion that talks about oneness and service and community, but inside these messages, according to what's been reported, it's framed as something sinister. Cult money. Weird backing. Profit complex. Those are heavy words. And when those words are sent to other A-listers, when they're sent to people with influence, with platforms, with social capital, that framing spreads fast. One message allegedly reads along the lines of, "It's all his cult money and backing." Another comment from someone in Blake's circle suggesting there's no need for weird cult money. Now, again, context matters. These are friends reacting to what they're being told. If your close friend tells you they're working with someone who is unstable, manipulative, cult-backed, you're probably not pulling out a theological encyclopedia. You're siding with your friend. That's human nature, but here's where it escalates. Ryan Reynolds reportedly responding with a story about a phone call to a trainer, allegedly Justin asking how much Blake might weigh shortly after giving birth because he had to carry her in a scene and mentioned low bone density. Now, in isolation, that sounds terrible. In isolation, it sounds like fat shaming. But in full context, we now know Baldoni had documented health issues, including spinal complications. So what is it? A health concern? An awkwardly phrased practical question? Or something more sinister? That depends entirely on who's telling the story, and that's the theme tonight. Who controls the framing controls the war, because what these texts reveal isn't just anger. It's positioning. It's narrative shaping. It's social coalition building. When someone writes that the director had zero experience, no taste, an enormous ego, believes he's some centuries prophet because he's in a cult, that's not venting. That's branding. That's character assassination language. That's the kind of phrasing you use when you want the listener to walk away disturbed, and maybe Blake believed it. Maybe she truly felt she was working with someone she couldn't trust. That's possible. We can't crawl inside anyone's head. But once those words are out there, especially in circles connected to people like Matt Damon, Ben Affleck, major Hollywood names, it stops being a private grievance and starts becoming industry gossip. One message allegedly jokes about having the name of a future documentary ready, Lights Cult. Another compares the production to Wild Wild Country, Fire Festival, Going Clear, essentially stacking cult and disaster documentaries on top of each other. It's sharp. It's sarcastic. It's devastating if believed, and then the claim that she rewrote the entire script. Directed every actor. That the cinematographer came to her when he couldn't get direction elsewhere. That she stitched the film together in 10 days while surviving on barely any sleep. That the director didn't know what he had because he didn't author any of it. If even half of that were true, it would be explosive. But if it's exaggerated, it becomes something else entirely, a battle for authorship. A battle for credit. A battle for control. Here's what stands out to me, the repetition of the cult framing. Over and over. In multiple messages. To multiple people. That's not accidental. That's reinforcement. When you repeat a label enough times inside a social group, it sticks. It becomes shorthand. It becomes identity. He's in a cult. He thinks he's a prophet. It's cult money. He's malignantly vain. He's a sociopath. Those aren't throwaway jokes. Those are heavy descriptors. And they create an image long before anyone asks for evidence. Now imagine being on the receiving end of that, and not even knowing those conversations are happening. Because these were private texts. These weren't Instagram captions. These weren't public statements. They were allegedly circulating quietly while production tension simmered publicly, and once that narrative spreads inside elite circles, it shapes how people respond. It shapes who takes meetings. It shapes who returns calls. It shapes which side people instinctively lean toward when headlines start flying. There's also an interesting psychological layer here. When you feel out of control in a project, when you feel sidelined, unheard, overruled, sometimes the brain looks for a bigger villain. Not just we disagree creatively, but this person is fundamentally compromised. A cult believer. A narcissist. A prophet complex. That makes the conflict feel justified. It gives moral clarity to frustration, but moral clarity can also be blinding, because from the outside, if you strip away the emotional charge, you see two powerful creatives clashing over control, authorship, and message. One side framing the other as manipulative and spiritually suspect. The other side largely silent publicly while legal tensions mount, and then there's the Hollywood Reporter artwork. Biblical imagery. David and Goliath framing. Visual storytelling that turns a production dispute into myth. Once media outlets lean into epic symbolism, nuance evaporates. It becomes good versus evil. Underdog versus tyrant. Cult versus feminist hero, but real life is rarely that clean. Meanwhile, on Coravanta, we've heard from actual Baha'i followers who say they feel caught in the crossfire. They're not celebrities. They're not in Hollywood boardrooms. They're regular people hearing their faith reduced to punchlines in leaked texts. That collateral damage matters, and it raises a deeper question: when does criticism of a person cross into ridicule of a belief system? When does creative conflict become religious mockery? We're not done. Not even close, because the back half of tonight's Coravanta episode shifts from Hollywood to something even heavier: detention centers, confiscated letters, free speech battles, FCC controversies, political infighting. The through line? Control of narrative. Control of voice. Control of who gets to speak and who gets silenced. But before we pivot there, let's sit with this for one more second. If these texts are authentic, and if they're accurately represented, they show a coordinated emotional campaign happening behind the scenes. Not a legal filing. Not sworn testimony. But raw messaging shaping perceptions among some of the most influential people in entertainment. And if you're Baldoni? If you're watching your reputation get defined in rooms you're not even in, that's not just frustrating. That's existential, because in Hollywood, perception is oxygen. And once someone whispers cult loud enough, people stop asking for proof. We're just heating up. From Hollywood smear narratives to media gatekeeping, FCC maneuvering, Texas politics, detention center allegations, and the internal fractures shaking political alliances. It's all connected. It's all about power. And it's all unfolding in real time. I'm Lars Harry, and this is Coravanta. So we've just walked through the Hollywood side of this, the texts, the framing, the cult narrative, the character shaping happening behind closed doors. But here's the thing about power struggles, they don't exist in isolation. They're part of a larger ecosystem. Whether it's film sets, media networks, or federal agencies, it always comes back to the same question: who controls the story? Because once you control the story, you control perception, and once you control perception, you control outcomes. Now we pivot from Hollywood texts to Texas detention centers, from leaked messages to confiscated letters, from celebrity power dynamics to federal regulatory muscle. Different arenas. Same battle. Let's talk about what's being reported out of Dilley, Texas. Allegations that federal agents entered dormitories inside a detention facility and confiscated letters written by detained children, letters that were reportedly intended for the outside world. Letters describing fear, conditions, illness, isolation. If that reporting is accurate, that is not a small thing. That is not administrative housekeeping. That is narrative control at its most primal level, because when a child writes, "I have never felt so much fear," and that letter leaves the facility, the public reacts. The public humanizes. The public questions policy. But if those letters never leave? If they disappear before they reach journalists? Before they reach advocates? Then the public sees statistics instead of faces, and statistics don't cry. That's why this matters. On Coravanta, we don't play partisan ping pong. We look at power structures. And if you believe in free speech, real free speech, then you can't selectively apply it. Either voices matter, or they don't. Either stories are allowed to surface, or they're managed to. And when the state steps between a detained child and their written words, that's not paperwork. That's intervention in narrative flow. Now zoom out. At the same time that detention center allegations are surfacing, you have a separate but related fight happening in broadcast media. A political candidate appears on a late-night program. The interview is recorded. Then it doesn't air. Official reasoning involves equal time regulations, FCC oversight, technical compliance. But here's where it gets interesting. For decades, late-night shows operated under a kind of understood carve-out. They were treated as entertainment, satire, personality-driven content, not hard political campaign platforms. That understanding shifts, and suddenly regulatory frameworks tighten. Is that coincidence? Is it procedural evolution? Or is it strategic? Again, we don't assert motives. But we observe patterns: when interviews are withheld, when segments are cut, when networks face merger approvals that require executive branch blessing, there is leverage. And leverage changes behavior, and then what happens? The interview goes online instead. It spreads further than it would have on television. The Streisand effect kicks in. Attempted suppression fuels amplification, the same way leaked texts amplified Hollywood conflict, the same way confiscated letters amplify outrage. Silencing attempts in 2026 don't bury stories. They detonate them, and this brings us to another fracture: political infighting. Public name-calling. Leaders turning on former allies. Endorsements weaponized. Loyalty tests enforced. The language of traitor. The rhetoric of internal betrayal. When a movement begins eating its own, that's not strength. That's instability, because movements built on personality eventually collide with internal dissent. And when dissent is labeled treason, what you're watching isn't debate, it's consolidation. Remember earlier when we talked about cult framing in Hollywood? Here's the uncomfortable parallel. In both cases, whether it's a film set or a political party, the accusation of cult behavior surfaces when disagreement becomes intolerable. When loyalty becomes binary. When criticism equals exile. It's the same psychological architecture. If you're not 100% aligned, you're out. That mindset destroys nuance, and nuance is oxygen in a functioning society. And now let's connect the threads clearly. In Hollywood, someone allegedly labels a director as cult-backed, profit-complexed, manipulative. The narrative spreads privately. In politics, regulatory bodies reinterpret rules affecting media interviews. The narrative tightens institutionally.in detention facilities, letters are allegedly intercepted. The narrative is physically blocked at different scales. Same mechanism, control the voice because voice is power when Blake allegedly describes rewriting scripts, directing actors, stitching together a film under pressure, that's authorship control. When Baldoni allegedly feels misrepresented in conversations he wasn't part of, that's narrative vulnerability. When a detained teenager writes about fear and that letter is confiscated, that's voice suppression. When a political interview doesn't air under regulatory reinterpretation, that's platform control. You may support one side. You may oppose another. But the pattern is structural and Coravanta is about structures. Here's what worries me most. We are entering an era where every institution, entertainment, government, religion, media, is locked in trust collapse. Nobody believes official statements. Everyone believes leaks. Private texts now outweigh press conferences. Anonymous sources outweigh polished interviews. Trust used to be vertical. Now it's horizontal chaos, and in that chaos, the loudest narrative wins first, not necessarily the most accurate one. That's why these Baldoni texts matter beyond gossip. They show how reputations are shaped socially before legal proceedings even begin. They show how belief spreads faster than verification, and once belief hardens, facts struggle to penetrate. Same with detention centers. Same with media suppression claims. Same with political loyalty wars. The human brain wants villains and heroes. It wants clean arcs. It wants cult leaders and righteous whistleblowers. It wants tyrants and freedom fighters, but real life? It's messier. Maybe Blake felt overwhelmed and lashed out privately. Maybe Baldoni felt blindsided and mischaracterized. Maybe regulators believe they're enforcing fairness. Maybe federal agents believe they're following procedure. Maybe political leaders believe strong rhetoric equals strength. Intent doesn't erase impact, and impact is what the public lives with. You know what's dangerous? When everyone starts believing the other side is fundamentally evil instead of fundamentally flawed. That's when compromise dies. That's when narrative warfare replaces dialogue, and that's when the word cult stops being metaphor and starts being mindset, because cult mentality isn't about religion. It's about rigidity. It's about insulation from criticism. It's about demanding total allegiance. We should be allergic to that instinct, no matter where it appears. Hollywood, Washington, Texas, anywhere. So here's where Coravanta stands tonight. If the texts are real, they reveal aggressive private character framing. That deserves scrutiny. If detention letters were confiscated, that deserves exposure. If regulatory changes silence interviews, that deserves transparency. If political leaders attack dissenters, betrayal, that deserves pushback. Consistency is credibility, and credibility is rare right now. As for the Blake Lively versus Justin Baldoni case, if this heads toward trial instead of settlement, every one of these private words becomes public oxygen. Every exaggeration becomes evidence. Every sarcastic line becomes sworn testimony, and once private hyperbole hits a courtroom, it stops being edgy and starts being risky, because juries don't care about Hollywood banter. They care about documented harm. That's why I keep saying, if both sides don't find a way to de-escalate, this thing won't just bruise reputations. It will permanently brand them, and reputational branding in the internet age doesn't fade. It archives. Same with governments. Same with political parties. Same with institutions. Everything is recorded. Everything is searchable. Everything is screenshot. We are living in the permanent memory era. So maybe the lesson across all of this, from cult accusations to confiscated letters to broadcast silencing, is restraint. Restraint before you text, restraint before you label, restraint before you suppress, because suppression doesn't erase. It multiplies. That's the paradox of this moment in history, and that's why we're here twice a day on Coravanta, not to scream, not to posture, but to trace the pattern: power versus voice, narrative versus truth, loyalty versus integrity. I'm Lars Harry, and this has been Coravanta.